Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our MPC Online Bible Study. My name is Matthew, the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church, where every Tuesday night we have a thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study, and we're continuing our Bible study series titled Journeying Through the Hebrew Bible, where we're looking at each of the individual books of the Old Testament and how they apply to our lives. We've looked at the Torah, the first 5 books of the law, and we looked at the history books, what we call the history books, but what in the Hebrew Bible is referred to the former prophets, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. And then we started to look at the prophets, which in the Hebrew Bible is referred to the later prophets. We looked at Isaiah and Jeremiah. And then recently we looked at the prophets that were sent to minister to the northern kingdom of Israel prior to its exile into Syria. Amos and Hosea, Jonah and Nahum to Nineveh, and all the other prophets as well, Micah as well, and Joel. Now what we're going to be doing tonight is that we're going to be looking at 3 other prophets. And these were prophets who ministered at the time after the northern empire of Assyria had collapsed and Babylon was starting to come to power. So this was after the northern kingdom of Israel went into exile, but prior to the southern kingdom of Judah being taken into exile by the Babylonians. And so what happened was, as the northern kingdom of Israel went, because they were faithless in their relationship to God, so eventually would the southern kingdom of Judah. In fact, the southern kingdom of Judah fared worse eventually than the northern kingdom of Israel. And so it was during this time that the Lord sent specifically 3 prophets. He sent the prophet Zephaniah, the prophet Habakkuk, and also Jeremiah. Now we've already looked at Jeremiah, and Jeremiah was very much Judah's last chance prophet before they went into exile, but those were the prophets that God sent. And tonight we're going to look specifically at Zephaniah and Habakkuk. There was another prophet who I mentioned whose name was called Obadiah, but he was not sent to the southern kingdom of Judah. He was sent to the nation of Edom, which sits southeast of Israel, modern day Israel, near the Dead Sea. And God sent the prophet Obadiah to them after the Jewish people, the people of Judah, had gone into Babylonian exile. There was also another prophet by the name of Ezekiel, and he was sent to God's people who, while they were in exile, and we're going to look at Ezekiel next week. And so these prophets, Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Obadiah, brought a very difficult word to God's people, particularly Zephaniah and Habakkuk, at a very difficult time. Now, very often, if you see someone who is going to be doing something that you know is going to be of harm to them, it would be irresponsible, callous, and unloving for you not to go ahead and warn that person. If you see a child who's about to burn themselves, maybe on a fire, you may even have to take drastic action to get their attention to stop them from going down this damaging path. And so the message that God brought to the kingdom of Judah at this time was like a drastic warning to his people. It was like a parent dragging a child away from the hot stove to not to burn them. And so the message almost sounds a bit like doom and gloom. But the fact is that it was coming out of a heart of love that God had for his people. So the first of these prophets that the Lord brought to the nation of Judah after the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom of Israel into exile was the prophet Zephaniah. And it is believed by scholars that Zephaniah was the great-grandchild of Hezekiah. Remember that Hezekiah was a good king. He reigned in the southern kingdom of Judah at the time of the Syrian Empire. God miraculously delivered Judah from the hands of the Syrians while Hezekiah was king. But Hezekiah, sadly, his son Manasseh was a very bad person. He was an evil king. And in fact, he was a monstrous king, let's put it that way. And for 50 years, he ruled Judah with a reign of terror. He sacrificed his sons to the vile god of the Ammonites called Molech. He engaged in the fertility cult of the nations around. The streets of Jerusalem poured blood of innocent lives because of the reign of King Manasseh, who was an evil king. And so it's likely that during this time that Zephaniah's parents had to hide themselves during the reign of Manasseh because they were of royal descent, and Manasseh was killing off anyone who was royal descent. And so it was into this context that Zephaniah was born, and so their parents named him Zephaniah, which means hidden of the Lord. After Manasseh's reign of terror came to an end after 50 years, his son Ammon also came to power, and he was also a bad king, and he reigned for about 2 years. And after the death of Ammon, his son Josiah came to power, and Josiah was 8 years of age when he was crowned king of Judah. And so it was during this time of Josiah's reign that the prophet Zephaniah started to minister. So it had been about 640 to 609 years before the birth of Christ. And what you need to remember that for over 60 years, the prophetic voice in Judah had been silenced because of the reign of Manasseh. Manasseh actually killed off any prophets who spoke against him. And so it was after this long period where the prophetic voice was not being spoken in Judah that Zephaniah speaks just as Josiah is about to come to the throne. And it's very likely it was due to the ministry of the prophet Zephaniah that it had an influence upon Josiah, because what happened was at 16 years of age, Josiah started to seek after God. And by the time he was 20 years of age, he was starting to become a reformer in the nation of Judah and to the peoples north of Judah after the northern kingdom of Israel went into exile. At 26 years of age, Josiah ordered the high priest at that time, a man by the name of Hilkiah, to search out the temple of God, to clean the temple. Because remember that during the reign of Manasseh, he was an evil king. He defiled the very temple of God. And so Josiah said it needed to be cleansed. And when Hilkiah, the high priest, was cleaning out the temple, he came across a copy of the book of the law of Moses. And so for many decades, God's law, God's ways had been neglected. And so when Josiah comes across the copy of the book of the law, he humbles himself before God. He cries out to God. He rends his garments. And he sets out a program of great reform across Judah and the northern part of Judah to turn God's people back to the Lord. He demolished all the idols. He destroyed all the high places. And what is very clear, it would seem that Zephaniah, the prophet, was speaking into this situation, and his words were obviously having an impact upon Josiah's life. And so the message of Zephaniah can be broken into 4 parts. The first part is God's judgment against Judah. And the reason why God was bringing his judgment against Judah, because Judah had neglected the word of the Lord. They had drifted in their relationship with God, particularly during the reign of King Manasseh. And so Zephaniah brings a word of warning saying that God is going to judge the nation of Judah. However, if they repent, if they turn back to God, God will relent from judgment, which shows that God's prophetic word was not something that was set in stone. It could change depending on how his people respond to God's law, God's word, which shows that God is personal, God is flexible. God changes his plans on the basis of how we respond to his word, like a loving parent will change their plans and how a child responds to their correction. We also have God's word of judgment against the nations surrounding Judah. And so God judges the nations around Judah, not on the basis of the 10 Commandments, but on the basis of human conscience, of what is right and wrong. So he speaks against the Philistines, the Moabites, the Ammonites, because they were heading for trouble. He speaks of the Assyrians. He said that the Assyrians, in fact, Zephaniah ministered just before the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So he speaks against the Assyrians and saying that they're headed for destruction because of their cruelty. And actually, in the year 612, year before the birth of Christ, the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, was destroyed by the Babylonians, just as the prophet Nahum had said hundreds of years beforehand. Then he also brings his judgment against Judah and the nations. God explains that the Lord explains to Zephaniah that Judah had become obstinate, rebelled against God, was resisting him, and because of this obstinacy, they were heading for complete disaster. However, at the end of Zephaniah, after all the doom and gloom, there is the promise of restoration for Israel and the nations. And we see here that there's a message of hope that comes right at the end of Zephaniah. That God takes no pleasure in death or the death of the wicked, that God will someday show mercy, that God will restore his people, that God will bring his people from every nation of the earth to himself and bring blessing upon them, that the Israel that has been scattered among the nations will be restored. And so this simply underlies the truth that God will still honor his covenant promise that he made to Abraham, the forefather of the Jewish people. And so from the New Testament perspective, we can see how this will be fulfilled in the life of Christ, that Jesus will one day judge the nations. He'll punish wickedness, but someday he will also restore his people who are called by his name. And so Zephaniah's message is a warning call to the nations of the earth, that they're heading for trouble if they don't turn to God and respond to his ways. Now, unfortunately, but obviously there was a context in which Zephaniah spoke, and that was during the time of Josiah's reforms. And obviously Josiah was influenced by the prophet Zephaniah in the reforms that he brought about. But unfortunately, the message of Zephaniah did not get into the hearts of the people of Judah, because after the death of Josiah and his ill-advised attack on the king of Egypt, where he died, the nation of Judah soon went back to their idolatry. They were rejecting God, which simply shows that acts of parliament do not change people's hearts. They only restrain evil, but they do nothing to change the heart. And so it was into this context, after the death of Josiah, eventually his son Jehoiakim came to power in Judah. And it's into this context that we come to the prophet Habakkuk, who ministered a number of years after Zephaniah. Now this is a really interesting book, because in some ways it's not a prophecy. It's more like a conversation between a man and God, between Habakkuk and the Lord. And Habakkuk is wrestling with some very difficult questions that he has with God. He's making his complaints with God about the state of affairs that his nation is in. And this is a wonderful book about our relationship with God, because Habakkuk shows us that we can be honest with God. We can complain to God. We can talk to God about the things that we're not happy about, and we can bring them before God, realizing that actually there's no question that is too big for God not to answer or to hear our complaints. Now, the issue that Habakkuk had with God was the issue of injustice. And it is a question that we are often bombarded with all the time. Why, if God is just, why does God allow so much injustice in our world? Why does he allow evil and suffering to continue in a world? Why does God allow the evil to go unchecked in the world? And Habakkuk was ministering about 20 years after the ministry of Zephaniah. As I mentioned, during the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, about 625 years before the birth of Christ. And so he was a contemporary of the prophet Jeremiah as well. And he is complaining to God. Habakkuk is complaining to God about the injustice in Judah. He's saying, God, there's a lot of wrong in this nation. Why are you allowing it to happen? Why are you allowing the widow and the poor to be oppressed? Why are you allowing the murderers to go off scot-free? The thieves are just getting away with blue murder, as it were. Why are things happening the way they are? And we see here an example of what we call interrogatory prayer. He is firing questions at God. And I think there's something here for us, that we can actually bring our questions to God of things that we're not happy about what we see in our world. And so the first part of Habakkuk is really his first complaint to God. He complains to God about the evil and he sees in Judah. He says, why do the innocent suffer and God does nothing about it? Why is justice in a land being perverted? Why are those in position of power perverting the course of justice? Why did the wicked get away and end up prospering? And so Habakkuk is wrestling over this with God in prayer. And God says in response that he will one day judge the wicked of Judah by the hand of the Babylonians. And so Habakkuk receives the answer, and he's satisfied with God's answer. But then this raises up more questions in the mind of Habakkuk, and this comes to his second complaint, and he says, hang on a minute, God. Okay, yes, so you're going to bring the Babylonians in to judge the wicked of Judah, but what about the innocent? Will not the innocent die? Why should the innocent also die with the wicked? And so God responds again to Habakkuk's plea, and he says that the righteous will live by faith. And so the Lord is making it clear that he will preserve the lives of the righteous, even from the destruction of the Babylonians, as long as they continue to walk in faith towards him. And obviously this is a theme that is picked up by the Apostle Paul when he wrote his letters as Galatians and Romans, that the just will live by faith. And of course the faith that Paul is speaking of is the faith that we put in Jesus Christ, that we are spared the judgment when we put our faith in Christ. But Habakkuk's concerns are still not addressed, because he then goes on to God and says, well, wait a minute, God, the Babylonians themselves aren't necessarily a shining light to the world. In fact, they are just as cruel as many other kingdoms of the earth. Where is the justice in that? And so God says that someday he will also judge the Babylonians. He will judge them for their injustice, their imperialism, their inhumanity, their intemperance, and their idolatry. And then when Habakkuk hears God's response, he is satisfied that God truly is a God of justice and will do what's just in the end. And so we close with the last chapter of Habakkuk, which is really a song of praise to God. He gives his thanksgiving to God, and he thanks God for he trusts God for God's protection in the future. And that he says, there's a very famous verse in Habakkuk where he says that though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes in the vine, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Even though the Babylonians were going to come and destroy the land, they had a scorched earth policy. Even though they would do that, he recognized that God is still just, and still yet he will rejoice in God's goodness as well. In fact, there's a famous phrase in the book of Habakkuk of the importance of writing down the vision, making it clear, and running with it. It's often a phrase that's often used in vision messages you often hear. And so there's much to the book of Habakkuk that we can learn. We don't always get all the answers to the questions that we have, but we can rejoice in the reality that in spite of all the evil and the wrong that goes in the world, that God is ultimately just, and that his justice will ultimately prevail. And so by the time we come to the prophet Obadiah, the city of Jerusalem had already been destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Jewish people had already gone into exile. Now, there is some debate amongst scholars as to when Obadiah ministered. Some people believe he ministered about 850 years before the birth of Christ. Others about 587 years before the birth of Christ, after the destruction of Jerusalem. But given that the book of Obadiah mentions the destruction of Jerusalem, I believe that this was the God sent this prophet to the kingdom of Edom, which we'll look at in a moment, after the destruction of Jerusalem and after the Jewish people gone into exile. And so the Lord brings the prophet Obadiah to the Edomites, who are the neighbors of the kingdom of Judah. Now you may remember that the Edomites were the descendants of Esau, who was Jacob's brother. And so Esau's the descendants were known as the Edomites, and they settled in what was known as the land of Edom, to the southeast of Judah, near the Dead Sea, renowned for its red rock, red sandstone. The two capital cities of Edom were Bozrah and Mount Seir. And so it's interesting that it has this red appearance because if you remember that Esau, his name means red, as does the name Edom mean red. And so the Edomites were a godless people. In fact, they built the famous city of Petra to the south of Mount Seir. And inside that city of Petra, there were temples built to various deities and gods that the Edomites worshipped, where human sacrifice would occur. And so for many years, the Edomites were a satellite city or satellite state of the kingdom of Israel, particularly during the reign of King David. But as Israel backslid in its relationship to God, eventually the Edomites rebelled against Israel and became an independent state. So a bit like, you remember the years of the Soviet Union, you had nations like Romania and Poland were satellite states of the USSR. So when Israel lost its influence, so when the USSR lost its influence and Poland became an independent state, so did the Edomites. Eventually, over time, Edom the Edomite influence was there for a while, but there was a man of Edomite descent by the name of Herod. And you may be familiar with Herod in your New Testament, because Herod was appointed as a king by the Romans when they took over Judea and Samaria. They took over that land. They appointed Herod as the king over Judea and over Israel. And so this was deemed a great insult and offense to the Jewish people who lived there at that time. And so Obadiah brings a message against the Edomites, and it can be, in these 21 verses, it is a message that can be broken down into three parts. Firstly, he brings his message of God's pronouncement of judgment against Edom, that Edom will one day be despised among the nations. And in a moment we'll see why. But this was a prophecy that took over 600 years to be fulfilled. Sometimes God's judgment takes time to be fulfilled. There's a saying, though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceedingly small, though with patience he stands waiting, with exactness he grinds all. Now, where is the people of Israel? They're still living, they're still surviving after thousands of years of persecution, being displaced. Where are the Edomites? They are gone. They are nowhere to be found. God has totally destroyed the Edomites. He has wiped them off the face of the earth. Then we see the reason why God is going to judge Edom. There are two reasons. Firstly, because they had become proud. They lived in the mountainous region in the land of Edom, and they regarded themselves as being unpregnable and untouchable, that not even God himself could touch them. And so God decided, well, we'll soon see who's God in all of this. And so God had to correct that. The second thing was that Edom showed no concern whatsoever over the demise of the Israelites and the people of Judah when they went into exile. In fact, they even rejoiced over it. They took advantage of the misery and the suffering. And so God says, well, because of that, I'm going to destroy you. I'm going to wipe you off the face of the earth. So in the final part of the prophet Obadiah, we see that God will deal with the nations that, depending on how they've treated Israel. So if nations have wrongly treated Israel, God will eventually judge them. And again, we see in this last part of Obadiah the concept of the day of the Lord, that God will one day right all the wrongs of history. And so Obadiah picks up a theme that is repeated in the prophet Ezekiel and also in the rest of the prophets, that God isn't just the God of Israel, but that God is also the God of the nations, and that God will judge the nations. And as I mentioned earlier, God will treat the nations depending on how they treat his people. So if nations curse Israel, they will be cursed. If nations bless Israel, they will be blessed. And we see that throughout history. It's a pattern that repeats itself again and again. God, in the same way, I also believe that God will also deal with those nations that persecute his church. His church is also his people as well. Do you remember what the Lord said to Saul when he was off to Damascus to persecute his church? Saul said, why do you persecute me? So when these nations, when these peoples try to destroy Israel or destroy his church, they're actually persecuting God. They're actually fighting against God. And so we see here that though this is a small and obscure book, that the fundamental issue is that God will eventually judge the nations in accordance of how they treat Israel and the church. And so the messages of Zephaniah, Habakkuk, and Obadiah remind us that God is not indifferent to injustice, whether with his people or among the nations. The Zephaniah warns Judah that judgment was near, but also appointed to a time of restoration. Habakkuk wrestled with questions of God and of justice and it shows that we can also wrestle with God with our questions. Obadiah declared the judgment of God on Edom because of its pride and arrogance and its lack of compassion towards Israel. And so these prophets emphasize that while God is slow to anger and patient in judgment, his justice will eventually prevail throughout history. And so for us as Christians today, these messages challenge us to trust God in his sovereignty when the world seems unjust, and to remain faithful in difficult times, and to recognize that God will ultimately set things right. And our response before God is to walk humbly before him, to trust in his timing, and to be a voice for righteousness in this broken world. Well, guys, that's our thought to think about as we looked at these three prophets. A question to ponder is this. I'd like you to discuss this in your life groups. How should Christians respond when it seems like the evil is winning in the world? How does Habakkuk's conversation with God help us to process injustice today? How does the concept of the day of the Lord shape our understanding of God's justice? And a text study, I'd like you to read Habakkuk chapters 2, verses 4 to 14. What does God mean when he says, the righteous live by faith? Why does God allow wicked nations like Babylon to rise in power? And how does he plan to hold them accountable? How can we cultivate a faith that trusts in God's justice, even when circumstances seem unfair? And how does this passage encourage you to remain steadfast in your faith with God? Well, guys, hopefully you got something out of that. Hey, listen, have a great rest of the day, and I'm looking forward to seeing you over the weekend. God bless you all.